Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody had some ice cream and some sugar and you'll stay up for this. As Jack mentioned, talking about the safety of smart meters, a lot of the conversations that we've had with both the consumers and the utilities and some of their PR departments were around the fact that now these meters have radios in them, and people were concerned about having that radio put onto the side of their house. So a lot of what you'll see in my presentation is around the RF safety. That's my area of focus, so that's what I'm comfortable talking about. Obviously, there's also concerns about, just electrical safety. There's some concerns about security and privacy as well. I'm not going to cover that in today's talk, but feel free to ask questions and I'll contribute as I can. I intended this presentation, this session, to be as interactive as possible, and you'll see that after each of the subtopics I've got some questions that I'll kind of ask you guys to share some experiences and have a little bit of a dialogue if we can as well. So first of all, there's some kind of general principles that I wanted to establish. One is that there's RF energy all around us. It's all the time, from the time of radio and television and then cell phones, Wi-Fi routers. I'm sure that all of you guys are aware you can go anywhere in public now, fire up your phone or your laptop and search for wireless routers, and you'll find a number of different devices around. It's part of our modern life. Obviously, the open-way devices, and this is true for all of the utilities and different vendors, they all operate within the regulatory limits. So the FCC, just like they govern cell phones and other RF devices, they have rules around how much power we can put out for each of these devices. And there are very specific rules for what they call RF exposure and the allowed exposure for either somebody that's a worker that knows that they're being exposed to stuff, or for the general public, and those levels will vary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of the concern about smart meters is based on misinformation. There's people that talk about, the meters are pulsing, and they're doing much higher radiation than they actually are. And of course, one of the wonderful things about the internet and information sharing, it's easy to go onto the internet and find a whole bunch of stuff that will talk about, how scary these things are. A lot of it does have some misinformation, unfortunately. So what I'll talk about is I'll talk first of all, what is RF exposure? What does it really mean? Why are people so afraid? What are the regulatory limits? What does the FCC have to say about this and those established limits? Are the Itron products compliant? And that really applies to, I think, all of the vendors have to be compliant to these regulatory requirements. And then how are the regulators reacting? A lot of the pressure comes back to the PUCs from concerned citizens, and they feel that pressure, and there's a lot of publicity around it. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the reactions there and then quick conclusions. So what is RF exposure? So RF exposure is really measured by the specific absorption rate. And a lot of this really came from the introduction of cell phones, right? We had radios for public safety and that for years, but it was always, folks that were, it was part of their job. And as the cell phones came out, the concerns about RF exposure really heightened. And there were, the specific absorption rate is really set as the standard for trying to understand, is this safe? Am I being exposed to levels of radiation that are going to cause harm? And a lot of that is really based around the heating effect of RF. So like a microwave, RF will cause excitation in physical, in your cells. If that's, if that excitation builds up heat and your body's unable to dissipate that heat, then it can cause damage, or it can heat up your popcorn. One of the key things, of course, is that when you look at the levels, within a microwave or any of any of these really strong transmitters, the meters are at a fraction of those levels, and I'll show you some of the references there. So thermal effects, as I mentioned, you can heat up tissue, through radiated emissions. These devices are so small compared to those limits that this really isn't the issue that most of the people have with these devices. Nobody's claiming that these things are causing damage to tissue, etc. So what are they afraid of? So there are a couple of key things that we hear about and we have discussions about. One of them is called hypersensitivity to radio frequency. And so there are people out there that that claim, and they may be true, I don't know, I'm not a medical person, but they'll claim that if they're around these radiations, these radios, that'll give them headaches, they can't sleep, nausea, a lot of different symptoms around being around RF. And I've grabbed a couple of things out of some publications to show you. Some of it's pretty alarming. People saying that they put a smart meter on their house and they can't live there anymore. So obviously it generates a lot of buzz and people get very concerned about it. It's not a generally accepted medical condition. So the medical community doesn't recognize it as as something that they can measure and say this is what happened. But there are certainly people that if they're experiencing those symptoms from whatever reason or whatever cause, it's real to them. The other one, and this is probably the one that that at least we focus on a little bit more and have a little bit more dialogue, is potentially long-term effects. Being exposed to this, right? It's not going to heat up your skin. It's not going to cause you a problem and burn you. But what happens if your children grow up and they've got a smart meter radio operating outside of their bedroom wall for years and years and years? Is there a long-term effect? And of course, those are very difficult things for us to measure because you need the long term before you know. One of the complications here for us is that examples such as asbestos and cigarettes, were originally not expected to cause any problems and subsequently were found to cause problems. So people are saying, well, maybe you're telling me now it's not a problem, but 20 years from now we're going to find out this is a problem. So it does create some fear and some concerns. Obviously, we look at the science and we say, we're well below all of the limits. We don't know of anything that says that these things are going to cause long-term problems. So, we're operating in good faith. We don't believe we're doing anything wrong. One of the other things, I don't have it in the slides here, but obviously the cell phone industry has gone through this well before the metering industry. And that was part of my previous career, was working for Nortel Networks and in the wireless and providing that. And so there's been studies that have been going on for over 20 years of the potential impact, long-term impacts of cell phone use. And as you can imagine, the radio in your cell phone is as powerful or more powerful than the radio in a smart meter, and people typically hold that radio right up to their head. And I'll also show that that if you look at the science and the physics, these radio waves fall off with the square of the distance, meaning that they fall off very rapidly. So as you get further away from something, the level of exposure drops very, very quickly. So having something right up to your head is very, very different than having a meter outside of your wall on the outside of your house, or even standing close to your meter. So these studies that they've done on cell phone exposure have not come back and said, we're seeing a trend where we're starting to see long-term effects of exposure to cell phones. One of the things that they looked at is the instances of brain cancer, because that's one of the big concerns, is that people holding cell phones up to their heads over a long period of time may cause some kind of an interaction that would accelerate the rates of brain cancer. And the one study actually saw that on a per capita basis, the instances of brain cancer is actually dropping. And they can't say definitely that means that there's nothing to worry about, but what they can say is that typically if they're going to see that long trend within a 15 to 20 year period of study, they'll start to see the beginning of that trend, and they're not seeing it. Encouraging for me. I mean, obviously I work around these meters all the time. When I'm in our facility, we've got banks of meters that we're working with. I want to feel safe as well. So there's really not any, what I would say, compelling evidence that says that we're seeing the beginning of any kind of a long-term impact. One of the things I also stress is that there's the smart meter. A lot of people have a Wi-Fi router. If they don't, their neighbors probably do. And radio and television waves. We're being hit by these these RF transmissions all the time. And unlike a smart meter or even a Wi-Fi router, radio and television is constant. You know, it's a constant RF energy that that's in and around us. Whereas these devices will tend to transmit for very short periods of time and then turn off and wait and transmit a little bit more. And I'll share with you some data on how little they really transmit when you look at it over time. So I want to maybe stop and have a little bit of discussion, let you guys talk a little bit as well. So first of all, how many of the utilities here have had to deal with complaints from consumers about concerns about radio? It's quite a few. And were these for smart meter deployments, for full two-way communications? Were any of them for what we call our ERT or bubble up meter? Yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting, and I've been with Itron for about 4 years, and most of the discussions that we've been having and most of the publicity came about when the smart meters came out. And one of the points that we made is that you realize that we've had these ERT meters in a lot of these areas for years and years and years before we went to smart meters, and now all of a sudden there's a major concern.
We had an AMR system for 20 years, and I never had to deal with any complaints except for the 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And people read on the internet, you get that smart meter off my house, and you start off going, it's not a smart meter, but that doesn't. They're worried about the RF.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's that. It becomes that emotional thing. It's like they read about it and they associate smart meters are bad, and my in-laws just got their notice that they're getting their smart meter, and so I can get a firsthand, and they said, well, don't you deal with that? Should we be afraid about this? And I said, well, that happens to be one of the things that I do for Itron, and obviously I'm convinced that they're safe, and I have one on my house. It's not an Itron meter, unfortunately, but I do have one on my house. And so you mentioned that it was about the RF. Are you also getting any concerns from the customers about like privacy?
I've heard it.
Yeah. And and again, there's a lot of misinformation out there. If you read out there, you would believe that, that the utility is going to be able to tell you what devices you're using in your home, how often you do certain things within your home. And a lot of it stems from, the home area network is intended to be able to talk to smart appliances and those type of things, and people get concerned. There's some concerns just about, well, the utility knows when I'm home and when I'm not home. Maybe they could if they really wanted to extract that data on an individual user basis, but and I think you guys all know that the utilities are not so much interested in each individual home and what their profile looks like. They're looking at aggregate profiles and looking at the overall thing. So there's a lot of talk about that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The NSA collects data in large volumes. As a utility, when we get a large number of these in service, because that seems the way that everybody's going to be going, are we going to be required to give out data as well?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Does anybody here from a utility, have they ever, or maybe they can't answer that question. I don't know. I'm not aware of anybody having to give that data up. No, well, I guess it depends on what they're after and what how they would use that to try and look at suspicious activities. It does bring to mind one of the interesting customers that we have is BC Hydro up in Vancouver and the British Columbia area. And one of the key business drivers for them to put in their smart grid system was because of theft. And in particular, the theft was from grow houses. So these are, guys that would go in and they would buy a house, they'd put a bunch of lamps in the basement and they'd grow marijuana. And originally when they started doing that, they were just a very good customer because they were more than willing to pay for the electricity. Until the authorities started saying, well, we want to know, where your abnormal usages are so that they could help try and pinpoint that. And that's when they started getting into the theft problem because these guys says, well, I'm glad to pay, but if it's gonna help them identify where my grow house is, I'm not gonna pay. And so they would start hiring linemen from the utility to come in and help them bypass and steal it instead of paying for it, because then it would take them it'd be a lot harder for them to find the grow house. So, there are instances where, the authorities will be looking at some of that data. In this case, they were just trying to find the grow houses. So now they've got to have a very elaborate system to try and figure out where their theft is and narrow it down to specific residences and chase these grow houses around. Any other unique experiences about this whole concern for RF and safety?
Well, we had a customer, she claimed she was some kind of doctor, and that our meters were making her sick. And she lived in multiple apartments, and she had aluminum foil over about 4 of the meters, or the nearest meters. And she kept saying it was making her sick and this and that. We just figured that she had bought the whole internet experience, hook, line, and sinker, and she just kept complaining and complaining. We finally said, all right, we're gonna come in and investigate. We went in, found 2 CO leaks, a natural gas leak, turned off all her gas appliances, and so we're not turning you on until we get it fixed. So it was a completely unrelated problem. And then later on, she was still complaining it was making her sick after it was fixed.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly we've had instances where people they've gotten a smart meter and then they've started complaining that they're making them sick. And in one case, one of the utilities, they actually went back and said, okay, we're taking it off. We're going to put a non-smart meter on. And everything was wonderful. Well, it turned out there was still a radio in the meter that was there. And so, yeah, some of it could be psychosomatic, and some of it could be, could be valid. I don't know, right? I don't know if hypersensitivity to RF is a real thing. I guess my conclusion as an engineer with some background is that if somebody truly is that sensitive to RF, I really feel bad for them, because there's no escaping it, right? Unless you live in one of these cities that, that bans RF and cell phones and TV and transmissions and all of that kind of stuff. In most of our lives, it's very difficult to be, to avoid exposure to the level that you would get from a smart meter. So let me move on to, I'll talk a little bit about the regulatory limits. So as I mentioned, the FCC and Industry Canada, and then of course there's the European and all of the Latin American, all of the world will have some form of regulation that, that controls how much RF we can put out into there. For RF exposure, it's broken down between occupational or controlled exposure versus general population or uncontrolled exposure. And the whole idea is, you can have a higher level of exposure for folks that understand what that is and they can limit their exposure, et cetera, versus the general population. A person gets a meter put on their house, they don't necessarily know that there's an RF coming off of that meter, so their limits are much, much lower for the general population uncontrolled. In the case of the RF from meters, the term that the FCC uses is maximum permissible exposure. So it just sets a limit. So this is how much exposure you're allowed to create from your devices. And it's based on, it's a function of the frequency. And again, a lot of this goes back again to the SAR and the absorption rate that changes with different frequencies. So that's why it's a function of frequency. But you can see that the denominator in calculating what that maximum exposure level is 5 times larger for the uncontrolled or general public. So, the level that the FCC would grant for a worker working in a lab or something like that versus for the general public is 5 times more constrained in terms of what that maximum level is. And the way that this is calculated per the FCC is it's calculated as a power density. So they look at how much radiated power is coming off of this and how much of that power per in this case square centimeter would be would be impeding on a person. And so you can see you take the transmitted power from the radio times the gain of the antenna, so you get the radiated power coming from the device, and then it's divided by 4 pi times the square of the distance. And I mentioned earlier about the square of the distance, and that's important because when you get further away from a device, it doesn't take a lot of space before those levels drop off very, very fast because it's divided by the square of the distance. So one of the other factors in the limits that are established is the fact that you can average over time. So again, it's all based on heating the human tissue from RF. Obviously, if you expose it to a little bit of RF and then it goes away, gives the body a chance to dissipate any heat that might have been created. And so the FCC allows you to average over a 30-minute period. And it's important in the sense for smart meters because smart meters will transmit in very, very short time durations, very, very short transmission cycles. In the case of the Itron devices, we've got a 150 millisecond transmit channel. So each meter would transmit in that little time frame, and then it would go off and wait, and if it had to transmit again, it would wait for the next time cycle. And you'll see that that it adds up to a very small amount of transmissions overall. But this really comes down to the duty cycle of the radio. So you can average over 30 minutes when you're looking at what your level of exposure or exposure is being generated. I put a note down here. We worked with, we've got a deployment of about 2 million smart meters in San Diego with SDG&E. And we did a little field study, and we found out that the maximum duty cycle of the meters is less than 1%. Matter of fact, it's, in this study, the maximum duty cycle for one of these devices was 0.58%. So a very, very small percentage. You're talking about minutes a day. As a matter of fact, I think I've got it in here, is that the average meter in their deployment of 2 million is, transmits for less than a minute a day on total. So these are very small transmission blocks through the day that add up to less than a minute. And you compare that to surfing the web using Wi-Fi or making a telephone call. It's a very small amount of exposure. So our Itron's RF device is compliant to the FCC limits. So I've got a table here that shows the RF LAN radio. So this is a 900 megahertz ISM band radio. We also have a Zigbee radio for the home area network that may or may not be enabled depending on the utility's configuration. I also put a couple of the versions of our ERT meters. So we've got a low power and a high power version of the ERT meters. And then I also put a cellular meter in here. And so, it's kind of hard to read with the font, but these are the limits that the FCC sets in terms of the power density, and this is the level of exposure from these devices, and these limits are set at 20 centimeters from the device, and this is just part of the standard. They had to pick a point where you would measure, and so it's about 8 inches from the device. And then this is the percentage of the limit that these things are. And you can see from these percentages that they're minuscule, right? Your RF LAN radio is less than 0.4%, not even a full 1% of the limit that's been established from the FCC. We had a consultant come in that had worked with the FCC when these limits were getting set. And he said that when they set the limits, there was a factor of 50 guard band on the limit that they set. So this 0.6 milliwatts per square centimeter already has a factor of 50 built into it. In other words, you'd have to have 50 times that before you really were heating up human tissue. And then we're 0.38% of that limit. So you can see that that even the cellular devices are very, very small, and a lot of that again goes back to this duty cycle thing. Is that these are based on these devices transmitting at about a 1% duty cycle for the meters. The ERT devices is even smaller. It's a 0.17, 0.18% duty cycle for those devices. Cellular meters, again, it's about a 1%. And it depends on how the utility has them set up, how many times they read the meters a day, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, very, very small duty cycles and very, very small fraction of the limit. So I mentioned that study at San Diego. So it was about 6,800 meters. And this shows you the distribution of the duty cycle for the meters. Is that the average meter had about a 0.06% duty cycle, which meant that it transmitted about 53 seconds a day total. Again, in very short 150 millisecond transmits. Maximum was the 0.58%, 497 seconds, 10, 15 minutes a day. And the reason that you see that variation is that in a mesh network, all of the devices are all trying to get back to one of the collectors. So the devices that are right next to the collector that are relaying messages from the other meters that are on the fringe, those are the ones that are going to have the higher percentage, and then the rest of the population will be lower. On average, it comes out to about a minute. Not a lot of transmission going on. This chart, and it's probably going to be hard for you guys to read, but it just compares various devices and their levels of RF exposure. And down in here you've got FM and TV broadcasting, and you can see that you've got an open way meter at 25 feet. That if you're 25 feet from one of your meters, you're actually well below the exposure you're getting, the constant exposure you're getting from many of the TV and radio broadcasts. Again, that'll depend on how far you are from a broadcast tower. But these, this is a Wi-Fi router, at 3 feet. And this is a meter, one of our meters at 3 feet. And then here's a microwave oven. And so, this is just the radiation, the allowed radiation that's coming off of a microwave oven, separate from the actual intended radiation that's cooking your food. And then this is a cell phone. And there's breaks in here, so this isn't to scale. You're talking 100 times the levels that are down in here. And so, the point being is that, you have to understand that these devices are very, very low in terms of the level of exposure that they're providing, even compared to some of the things that we're exposed to every day, and especially when you talk about microwaves and cell phones in particular. And, I've attended a number of meetings where, we're supporting some of the utilities at a town hall meeting where, their customers are concerned about RF. And people will come in and they'll have a lot of claims about, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. And they have a cell phone. And, and I'm saying, if you're really worried about that, aren't you worried about the exposure from your cell phone? Because I happen to know how significantly more dangerous, if you're worried about exposure, that cell phone is. Well, they tend to feel a lot differently. And I think, for me, my experience is it's because they want the cell phone, right? So if they want a cell phone, they're going to overlook a lot of the concerns about RF and stuff. Whereas something that comes from the utility and a meter put on the side of their house, it's somebody forcing something onto them, and they're going to look at it a lot differently and be a lot more critical about that device versus another device, even though the physics says that the other device is much more dangerous to them in that regard. So discussion. So in the interactions that you guys have had, do you get a sense that that these folks have any understanding of the limits and what the RF exposure is from these devices? None whatsoever. Yeah, that's my experience is that it tends to be a very emotional thing, right? I mean, being an engineer, right, I went to these meetings and I'm all prepared with my facts and all of the science behind this, and I quickly realized that, I might as well just be talking a different language to these folks. They don't understand any of that, right? Even you try and create a nice simple graphic that shows them, look at this is this and this is this. Lower is better. They still, I read that these things are bad, and I know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that, they got sick because of these meters. So it's a very emotional thing. Again, a lot of misinformation, but it's, for the folks that believe it and the folks that are, that read this stuff, they do believe it, and it's real to them. So, you have to recognize that as you're dealing with them. The other thing is, just, making sure that folks understand that there's nothing unique in terms of the smart meter on the side of your house and RF exposure. You've been exposed to RF for years and years, and it's going to continue to get more exposure. We as a society, as a modern society, are fully dependent on RF communications. If you guys can imagine, if all of a sudden we turned off all of the RF communications, our standard of living would drop. And even public safety, you want to have the firemen and the police and all of those folks that are dependent on wireless, not use it because you're concerned about potential long-term effects that haven't been proven. Got to think about that. And the last one, and we had a lot of discussions with the utilities, and when these issues came up, and they would hire consultants. The folks opposing this would hire consultants, and they were smart people, and they would say, well, can't you do something to lower the emissions from your meters? Can you make them only bubble up once a day? And so instead of transmitting a minute a day, they only transmit for 25 milliseconds a day, and just give you one read a day. And we looked at it and we said, well, one, mesh networks don't work that way. Mesh networks need constant, kind of communications to maintain timing and all of that type of stuff. There's alarms and alerts that have to come when they have to come, blah, 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 blah. And then we started getting into it. And we said, well, what would happen if we did? What if we were able to reduce the emissions by 50%? Do you think that's going to make a difference to that person that read something on the internet that these meters are bad? Those charts might change a little bit, but my personal feeling is I don't think it'll make any difference. You could reduce it by 90%. And we quickly came to that agreement mainly with the California utilities, because they were getting a lot of pressure from the PUC out there, that it's an all or nothing. You're either going to give those people a meter and it's going to work the way it's going to work with the RF and they're going to accept it, or you're going to give them an opt-out and you're going to give them a meter that has no radios in it. So how are the regulators reacting? So again, there's a very, what I see is a very small but very vocal community that's against the smart meters, and they're using the tools like the internet that's available to them to create a store. And frankly, I believe that there's some consultants that just look at this as an opportunity, right? They might not believe it, but they can go off and get people excited and get gigs to do this. I mentioned the California PUC. Despite Southern Cal Edison, PG&E, and San Diego all pushing against it and trying to avoid it, they ended up having to provide an opt-out option. And and obviously you guys understand that if you're moving from to a smart grid and a full two-way AMI, part of the whole business proposition is you're going to eliminate the need for meter readers. And now you've got these opt-outs that you can't predict where they're going to be, but now you've got to have meters that are going to be manually read. Fortunately, the PUCs, at least so far, have agreed that the people that choose to opt out in that scenario will have to pay some form of fee because it's more expensive for the utility to bring their meter information back than all the rest of the population. And that has made a big difference. So before they started this, they would do some polls and say, well, if you had an option to opt out, would you opt out? And you might get 5, 10%, I think even to 15%. People said, yes, I would opt out. Then they come back and say, it's going to cost you $15 a month to opt out because it's going to add cost. Well, now we're seeing less than 1%. Maybe just over 1% opting out. So it certainly makes a difference, if they have to pay a little bit more for the option to opt out. And people get very emotional about that and saying, well, what do you mean I have to pay to not have you put that meter on my house? And it's, well, it's part of a larger program to try and control the cost for the utility and keep the rates from going up even faster than they have been. So it's very interesting when you look at the opt-out. Most of the PUCs, where they're getting large-scale deployments, are supporting the opt-out and forcing the utilities to support that. We see that trend. BC Hydro was one of the ones that, they fought it probably harder than anybody because, as I mentioned earlier, one of their big business drivers was because of the theft coming from these grow houses. Well, as soon as the PUC, or for the equivalent of the PUC for them, says, well, you got to give the option of an opt-out, well, of course all of the grow houses are going to opt out. And we said, well, that's unfortunate, but maybe now you've taken your population of suspects down to however many people opt out. Now you know that it's within that pool, right? So there are other ways that I think they can do that. I keep thinking, well, couldn't you do some thermal imaging? Because in the middle of a cold night in Vancouver, a grow house is going to show up very, very bright on a thermal image, but I don't know. But anyway, so I guess the bottom line is that most of the regulators, are forcing the utilities to provide these opt-out programs. And as I mentioned, in the case of PG&E, they were one of the first that implemented their opt-out program in California. It was $120 up front and $20 a month. The more recent ones that I've seen, I think those numbers are coming down a little bit more, maybe more about $10 to $15 a month. It depends on the utility and what their costs are. It's all based on their cost structure. One of the other concerns with the utilities is that when you're doing a mesh network, obviously, the strength of the mesh is really around having a lot of nodes and a lot of different paths for communications to get back to the collectors. As soon as you start pulling nodes out by these opt-out customers, you create holes in that mesh, and if there's enough of them, then all of a sudden this nice mesh that was working has holes, and then they got to go out and put range extender devices out there to fill the holes, and it can get very complicated. Fortunately, the number of opt-outs and the percentage of opt-outs hasn't been great enough that any of the utilities, at least that I've been working with, have had to go out and do any RF mitigation to fill the holes.
Do you know if they capped the number of opt-outs that they could do?
I'm not aware of any cap. I don't think they can. I think once they have to provide it, anybody that wants to and chooses to opt out, they have to support them. And obviously the upfront is, if it's somebody opting out and they've already deployed the smart meter, they've got to go back and put a electromechanical meter in place, and then of course every month or 2 months they've got to have somebody go read the meter. So, how many of the utilities represented here have to have an opt-out program?
We don't have to.
So you've voluntarily done it. The other ones, is it a mandated thing that you have to, or same?
Iowa doesn't require an opt-out program. They're basically on our side, so. With our AMR, we maybe had 10 or less people upset about it. We must not be as sensitive as Californians.
Yeah, there was definitely a very West Coast bias towards a lot of the activity, but but even like Maine, Central Maine had a lot of people that were concerned, and then one of the other concerns that we had, especially in California, is that we started seeing municipalities within a utilities coverage area that would get excited about it, and the concern was that you would get pockets of like-minded people that would all say we're all opting out. And then you truly do create a big hole in your mesh, and then now you've got to figure out, well, how do I go in there and and bridge all of the RF gaps that have been created by this? But again, we fortunately we haven't seen that. The numbers just haven't been that high. So with that, conclusion is one: smart meters from a RF exposure, very, very small. And I'm talking, all of these figures that you guys have seen, those are based on, the limits that are set about 8 inches from the meter. And, typically meters are on the outside of houses, not on the inside of houses. They're also mounted in a metal box, at least for our meters, and I think most of the other meter vendors. The antenna structure within that meter is intended to concentrate the RF out away from the meter and not back towards the house, because that's not the communication path that you're trying to establish. That, along with the metal box and just the home building materials, we worked with EPRI on doing some studies, and they found that there's at least 10, sometimes 15 dB difference right behind the meter versus right in front of the meter. So this these measurements that are 8 centimeters are right in front at the peak, versus you're almost 10 or 15 dB lower when you go on the inside of the wall behind that meter, which is where most people are concerned. there, you know, there are no, you know, there at least no credible information that we've seen from the medical community that says yes, there is an issue with, you know, exposure to this. I think we'll see that first from cell phones if anything ever happens, you know, that is concrete and real. We do recommend though that, you know, you have to take this seriously as an engineer. You know, I look at the data and it's very clear to me that these are very, very low levels, but I also have to recognize that the people that don't understand that, you know, that's a lot of mystery. It's very emotional. There's a lot of emotion involved in this, and you know, you have to recognize that and say, you know, we're not trying to force something on you. You know, we certainly wouldn't, you know, utility's not going to, you know, expose people to things that, you know, that they know are bad. You know, but take it seriously. And then the other one on the bottom one there is, you know, is try to turn the conversation towards the benefits, right? And I'll go back to the cell phone thing. The same people that are complaining about a meter being on the side of their house, they have a cell phone. And because they want that cell phone, they need that cell phone, and they'll ignore or accept whatever risks are associated with that. If people, you know, we're focused more on the benefits of AMI and smart meters and stuff, they'll realize that, oh yeah, I do want that device on my house because now I can, you know, I can save money by better tracking my my energy usage, et cetera, utility saving money. So that's presentation. I'll open it up to any questions.
We do television and radio interference investigations, and some people claim that they hear humming at a collector station, or I'm just wondering. I know you comply with the FCC, but I'm wondering, is there a certain percentage of these meters that might cause us problems with television or radio interference within somebody's home?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So, you know, the question is, you know, is there instances or concern about, you know, the meters and the radios and the meters causing interference to television, radio, other things in the home? And certainly, anytime you're talking about RF, there's always a risk of that. I haven't seen any instances where we've had any trouble with interference with television or radio. Now, we have instances where other devices that are using that shared spectrum, because this is unlicensed spectrum in the 900 megahertz ISM band, you might have a baby monitor, you know, garage door openers, different things that would use that same spectrum. Most of the interference concerns are, you know, are with devices that are not following the frequency hopping type of an algorithm. So these meters, you know, in our case, you know, there's I think 52 different channels that we utilize within that spectrum. And so every time a meter transmits, it's jumping to a different frequency. And the whole intent is, one, to make them very immune to other interferers. If somebody else is trying to use that band, the next time he tries, he's going to be a different frequency. Chances are he'll get through. But it also means that we don't interfere that often because we've got these very short transmission periods. But typically, most of the interference stuff will come from, you know, devices that are fundamentally analog in nature. You know, so like baby monitors that utilize 900 megahertz. We've had a couple of instances. We had a couple of instances with some of the RF security lighting. And mainly it was around some of the lower cost imported ones that didn't do a very good job of designing for, you know, for interference protection. But we haven't had anything with, you know, like with TV or radio, mainly because, you know, our bands of transmission are far enough away from them, and our levels are low enough that we haven't had any issues. But we've had a few. And it's been very few, and you know, in some cases, I think the utility has gone out and replaced a security monitor, a motion sensor-based device that used the 900 megahertz with one that, you know, that we know does a good job of frequency hopping, as opposed to one that's stuck on a channel. So.
Just as a comment, we have, I think we probably have about 30 people that have opted out of 1.2 million, so it's not kind of huge. But you know, we've had a kind of a one-off from this where you know, we'll go out and change someone's meter. You know, we had these electromechanical solid state meter. And then that's what sets off an alarm bell, and then we get a call and say, get that smart meter off. And it's not that they just don't want a solid state meter, and so we'll go back and we'll replace it with electromechanical, and we don't charge for that, and they go away happy. But I guess it's sooner or later, that's gonna, we're gonna run out of that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, folks, really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming.
Right?